My name is Charmaine St, and the night before I was supposed to legally marry Jordan Banks, his family revealed what they truly wanted from me. Not love, not partnership, not a future together. They wanted my house, my money, my career, and every dollar I would earn for the rest of my life. By the end of that night, one family was publicly destroyed, a wedding was canceled, and my phone was drowning in desperate calls from people who had spent months trying to turn me into their personal bank account. But none of that happened by accident. The truth is, that disaster began long before the wedding. It began with a little girl who spent her entire life believing that if she worked hard enough, someone would finally choose her. If you've ever chased love from people who only valued what you could do for them, then you already know how dangerous that hope can be. I grew up in Fairfield, Connecticut, in the kind of neighborhood people point to when they talk about success. Our house sat on a quiet street lined with beautiful trees and expensive homes. The lawn was always perfect. The windows were always spotless. The holiday decorations always looked like something from a magazine. From the outside, we looked like a family that had everything figured out. Inside the house, things felt very different. My mother, Elaine, believed excellence was the minimum requirement for existence. She never hugged me after a difficult day. She never told me she was proud of me for trying my best. Instead, she measured people by what they accomplished. The better you performed, the more attention you received. The moment you stopped performing, you became invisible. I learned that lesson early. When I was 10 years old, I won first place in a statewide academic competition. I spent weeks preparing for it. I remember standing on stage holding a trophy almost as large as my torso, searching the crowd until I found my mother. I expected a smile. I expected excitement. I expected something. Instead, when we got into the car, she asked why I had missed one question in the final round. One question. That was all she remembered. By the time we arrived home, my trophy was sitting in the back seat, and I was staring out the window, wondering why victory felt so empty. Years later, when I graduated near the top of my class, the reaction wasn't much different. My mother attended the ceremony, took photographs, and congratulated me. For about 3 minutes. Then she spent the rest of lunch talking about the daughter of one of her friends who had earned a scholarship to a more prestigious graduate program. Every achievement in my life seemed to come with a reminder that someone else had done something better. Eventually, I stopped chasing praise and started chasing results. Results felt safer. Results didn't change their minds. Results didn't wake up one morning and decide you weren't enough anymore. As I got older, that mindset became my greatest strength and my greatest weakness. While other teenagers spent weekends at parties, I studied. While my friends focused on relationships, I focused on building a future. I told myself I was being responsible. The truth was much simpler. I was terrified of failing because failure felt like proof that maybe I really wasn't worth loving. College only intensified that mentality. I pushed myself harder than everyone around me. I accepted internships when others took vacations. I volunteered for projects nobody wanted. I worked late. I worked weekends. I worked until exhaustion became normal. Every sacrifice felt justified because success was the only thing that consistently rewarded my effort. When I entered the technology industry, I discovered a world perfectly suited to my personality. The environment was competitive, demanding, and brutally honest. Nobody cared about excuses. Nobody cared about intentions. You either delivered results or you didn't. I thrived there. Promotions came quickly. Responsibilities increased. My reputation grew. Executives began requesting me for major acquisition projects. Investors trusted my judgment. Competitors respected my negotiating skills. By my early 30s, I was helping oversee deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. By 35, I was a senior vice president at a major technology firm. The salary was extraordinary. The bonuses were life-changing. More importantly, every dollar felt earned. Nobody handed me anything. Nobody rescued me. Every success was built on thousands of hours that nobody else ever saw. A few years before everything fell apart, I relocated to Atlanta. The city offered opportunities, growth, and distance from the emotional weight of my childhood. Eventually, I purchased a custom-designed villa in Buckhead. It wasn't just a house, it was evidence. Evidence that every sleepless night had meant something. Evidence that every sacrifice had produced results. The property was beautiful. floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked landscaped gardens. A private office occupied an entire section of the home. Every room reflected years of planning and discipline. The day I received the keys, I stood alone in the foyer listening to the silence. I thought I would feel triumphant. Instead, I felt something unexpected. Lonely. Success had solved many problems. It had not solved that one. The truth most people never talk about is that loneliness doesn't disappear when your bank account grows. Sometimes it gets worse. People become harder to trust. Relationships become more complicated. You never know whether someone appreciates you or appreciates access to your life. Over the years, I dated occasionally. Some men were intimidated by my career. Others became competitive. A few seemed more interested in my lifestyle than my personality. One relationship ended because a man couldn't tolerate earning less money than I did. Another ended because he constantly joked about becoming a stay-at-home husband while secretly resenting every professional achievement I celebrated. After enough disappointment, I stopped expecting much. I convinced myself that maybe love simply wasn't meant for people like me. Then, something happened that changed everything. One Thursday evening, I attended a charity fundraiser supporting educational programs for underserved students. I almost skipped the event because I was exhausted from a week of corporate negotiations. A colleague persuaded me to attend because our company was one of the primary sponsors. I arrived late and planned to stay less than an hour. Then I noticed a man speaking with a group of donors near the stage. He wasn't trying to dominate the room. He wasn't demanding attention. Yet people naturally listened whenever he spoke. There was something calm about him, something steady, something familiar. Throughout the evening, I watched him interact with volunteers, business leaders, and local families. He remembered names. He asked thoughtful questions. He seemed genuinely invested in helping people. For someone like me, who spent most of her time surrounded by aggressive personalities and corporate politics, that kind of warmth felt rare. Eventually, we were introduced. His name was Jordan Banks. He directed a nonprofit organization focused on youth development and community outreach. Our conversation lasted less than 20 minutes, but I remember leaving with a feeling I hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Jordan didn't seem threatened by my success. He didn't obsess over my income. He didn't spend the evening trying to impress me. Instead, he listened. He asked questions about my goals, my experiences, and the challenges I faced as a woman in corporate leadership. For the first time in a very long time, I felt seen instead of evaluated. Driving home that night, I caught myself smiling for no reason. Looking back now, that smile feels almost tragic. Because while I was wondering whether I had finally met someone who genuinely cared about me, there was another possibility I never considered. What if Jordan Banks wasn't interested in the woman at all? What if he had already noticed the villa, the executive title, the investment portfolio, and the life I had spent decades building? 2 weeks later, Jordan called and asked me to dinner, and that single phone call would quietly begin the most expensive mistake of my entire life. When Jordan called 2 weeks later, I almost let the call go to voicemail. At the time, my schedule was a disaster. I was leading negotiations on a major acquisition, flying between cities, sleeping far less than I should have, and surviving almost entirely on caffeine and determination. Dating was not a priority. In fact, I had spent the previous year convincing myself that relationships were mostly distractions disguised as opportunities. Fortunately for Jordan, he chose the exact right moment to challenge that belief. His message was simple. He said he had enjoyed our conversation at the fundraiser and wondered if I would be interested in dinner. There was no pressure, no flashy pickup line, no attempt to impress me, just a straightforward invitation. I remember staring at the message for several seconds before responding. Something about the simplicity felt refreshing. Most men approached me with one of two strategies. They either tried too hard or they gave up too quickly. Jordan seemed to do neither. 3 nights later, we met at a quiet restaurant overlooking the Atlanta skyline. I arrived first and immediately noticed something unusual when Jordan walked through the door. He wasn't trying to perform. He wasn't scanning the room to see who was watching him. He wasn't treating the dinner like an audition. He simply smiled, greeted me warmly, and sat down. That alone made him different from most of the men I had dated. The conversation flowed effortlessly. We talked about our careers, our families, and our goals. Jordan spoke passionately about community programs and mentorship initiatives. He told stories about young people who had transformed their lives through education and support. He described the challenges his nonprofit faced and the victories that kept him motivated. More importantly, he listened when I spoke. Most people heard my job title and immediately started asking questions about money, investments, or business connections. Jordan asked about experiences instead. He wanted to know what drove me. He wanted to know what success felt like after years of sacrifice. He wanted to know whether I was happy. That last question caught me off guard because almost nobody ever asked it. People assumed success automatically produced happiness. Jordan seemed to understand that the two were not always the same thing. At the end of the evening, he walked me to my car. There was no awkward pressure, no expectation, no attempt to force intimacy. He simply thanked me for dinner and told me he hoped we could do it again. I drove home smiling. That second date became a third. The third became a fourth. Before long, seeing Jordan became the highlight of my week. For the first time in years, I found myself making room in my schedule for someone else. He seemed to understand parts of me that most people overlooked. When I talked about work frustrations, he listened without becoming defensive. When I celebrated victories, he appeared genuinely proud of me. When I described the pressure that came with leadership, he never minimized it. Looking back now, I understand something important. Manipulative people rarely begin with manipulation. They begin with validation. Jordan never pushed. He observed. He learned. He adapted. At the time, I interpreted that as emotional intelligence. Months later, I would wonder if it was actually something much more calculated. One evening, about 2 months into our relationship, we sat on the balcony of my villa watching the Atlanta skyline glow beneath the night sky. Jordan looked around the property and smiled. Most visitors commented on the architecture or the view. Jordan focused on something else. He told me the house represented discipline. He said most people only saw the reward but never appreciated the years of sacrifice behind it. The comment landed perfectly because it reflected exactly how I felt. It was the kind of thing I wish someone had said years earlier. That became one of Jordan's greatest strengths. He always seemed to know exactly what I needed to hear. If I was exhausted, he spoke about balance. If I doubted myself, he spoke about resilience. If I worried about the future, he spoke about partnership. He never rushed the relationship. He never demanded anything. He positioned himself as a safe place in a world that often felt exhausting. Over time, I began sharing parts of myself that I normally kept hidden. I told him about my mother. I told him about the pressure I felt growing up. I told him how difficult it was to trust people. Jordan listened carefully to every story. Sometimes he would simply hold my hand and tell me I deserved better. Those moments felt genuine. They felt healing. They also created a level of emotional trust that would later become incredibly dangerous. Around the third month of our relationship, Jordan introduced me to his family. He spoke about them constantly before I met them. According to Jordan, family was everything. He described Sunday dinners, holiday traditions, and lifelong loyalty. As someone who had spent years longing for genuine connection, those stories appealed to me. They painted a picture of warmth that felt completely different from my own upbringing. The first family gathering took place at his mother's home. Dolores Banks greeted me at the door with a bright smile and an enthusiastic hug. She seemed welcoming, energetic, and deeply invested in her family. Throughout the evening, she asked questions about my career, my childhood, and my future goals. At first, I appreciated the attention. Then I noticed something strange. Almost every conversation eventually circled back to work. She asked about promotions. She asked about executive responsibilities. She asked about business travel. She asked about real estate. The questions were subtle enough to avoid suspicion, but looking back, they formed a pattern. At the time, I ignored it. I wanted the evening to go well. Jordan's older brother, Tyrell, made a different impression. He carried himself like a successful entrepreneur. He talked confidently about investments, business ventures, and future opportunities. Yet many of his stories felt strangely vague. Whenever conversations moved toward specifics, he redirected them. His wife, Tasha, compensated by talking enough for both of them. She loved appearances. She loved status. She loved being associated with success. During dinner, she repeatedly joked about moving into a mansion someday. Everyone laughed. including me. I had no idea how ironic those jokes would eventually become. Despite a few moments that felt slightly unusual, I left the gathering feeling optimistic. For the first time in my life, I felt as though I was being welcomed into something bigger than myself. Jordan noticed my mood during the drive home. He smiled and squeezed my hand. "See?" he said. "I told you. Family changes everything." At the time, I believed him. What I didn't realize was that while I was becoming attached to the idea of belonging, other people at that dinner may have been becoming attached to something else entirely. Because several days later, a conversation took place behind closed doors that I knew absolutely nothing about, and that conversation would quietly change the direction of every event that followed. The conversation I mentioned at the end of the last chapter happened without my knowledge, and for a long time I never questioned it because I was busy falling in love. Looking back now, that was probably the most dangerous stage of the entire relationship. Not because anything obviously terrible was happening, but because everything seemed almost perfect. Perfection has a way of lowering your defenses. Over the next several months, Jordan became a constant presence in my life. We spent weekends exploring Atlanta, attending community events, and hosting small dinners at my villa. For the first time in years, my home no longer felt empty. There was laughter in the kitchen. There were conversations on the balcony that stretched late into the night. There was someone waiting for my text messages and asking how my day had gone. It felt natural. It felt comfortable. It felt like the future I had quietly hoped for but never expected to find. Jordan was remarkably consistent. He remembered details. He remembered meetings I was nervous about. He remembered birthdays of people I cared about. He remembered stories I had told months earlier. Every time life became stressful, he seemed to appear with exactly the right words. When a major acquisition nearly collapsed during negotiations, Jordan listened to me vent for 2 straight hours without once trying to turn the conversation back to himself. When the deal eventually closed successfully, he surprised me with a quiet dinner instead of some extravagant celebration. "You already have enough people who admire your success," he told me. "You deserve someone who appreciates the work behind it." At the time, those words felt incredibly meaningful. They also reinforced something that was becoming increasingly important to me. Jordan made me feel understood. One evening, several months into our relationship, we sat beside the fireplace in my living room while a thunderstorm rolled across Atlanta. Rain tapped against the massive windows and lightning illuminated the skyline in the distance. Jordan had his arm around my shoulders while we talked about the future. That conversation would later replay in my mind countless times. "What do you want your life to look like 10 years from now?" he asked. It seemed like an innocent question. I told him I wanted stability, peace, and meaningful relationships. I explained that I had spent so much of my life focused on achievement that I was finally ready to build something personal. Jordan smiled. "That's exactly how I think about it too," he said. "People spend so much time chasing money that they forget the real goal is legacy." Legacy. That word became one of Jordan's favorites. The more serious our relationship became, the more often he used it. At first, I thought he was talking about family values, community impact, and future children. Those seemed like reasonable topics for two adults discussing a long-term future. Whenever Jordan talked about legacy, his eyes lit up. He described families supporting each other across generations. He described creating opportunities for relatives and building something bigger than individual success. Most of what he said sounded admirable. In fact, many of his beliefs aligned with my own values. Success meant more when it benefited people you cared about. The idea seemed simple enough. What I failed to notice was how often Jordan's vision of the future centered around his family rather than ours. The distinction was subtle. Too subtle for me to recognize at the time. Around that same period, I began spending more time with the Banks family. The invitations became more frequent. Sunday dinners turned into regular traditions. Birthday celebrations, church events, and family gatherings filled my calendar. Part of me loved it. Growing up, I had always felt like an outsider looking through a window at other people's lives. The Banks family appeared close-knit and supportive. They celebrated together. They defended one another. They seemed connected in ways my own family never had been. Dolores especially appeared determined to make me feel welcome. She constantly referred to me as family, even before Jordan and I became engaged. Whenever introductions were made, she proudly called me her future daughter-in-law. The title made me uncomfortable at first, but eventually I began to appreciate it. It felt like acceptance. It felt like belonging. Unfortunately, acceptance can sometimes be confused with access. The more time I spent around Dolores, the more personal her questions became. She asked about my work schedule. She asked about future promotions. She asked whether I planned to remain in Atlanta permanently. She asked whether I had ever considered expanding my real estate investments. The questions always arrived casually, wrapped inside normal conversation. Nothing felt aggressive. Nothing felt suspicious. Yet looking back now, I realized she knew an extraordinary amount about my finances compared to most people in my life. One Sunday afternoon, she visited my villa for the first time. Jordan had been encouraging me to host a family dinner, and eventually I agreed. Dolores arrived nearly 40 minutes before everyone else. She claimed she wanted to help with preparations. Instead, she spent most of her time touring the property. She complimented every room. She admired the architecture. She praised the design choices. At first, I found it flattering. Then she began asking unusual questions. How much did property taxes cost? Was the house fully paid off? Had I considered adding another guest wing someday? Did the neighborhood have strict residency requirements? The questions came quickly enough that I eventually laughed and asked whether she was planning to buy a similar property herself. For a split second, something flashed across her face. It disappeared almost immediately. Then she smiled and changed the subject. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Today, that moment feels very different. Tyrell's behavior also became easier to observe. The more time I spent around him, the less convinced I became by his stories of business success. His explanations were always vague. His plans were always enormous. His opportunities were always just around the corner. Yet tangible results never seemed to materialize. Whenever financial topics surfaced, Tyrell talked like a millionaire waiting for the world to catch up with his genius. Tasha enthusiastically supported every claim. According to her, they were always one opportunity away from becoming wealthy. One investment away, one partnership away, one breakthrough away. Somehow that breakthrough never arrived. Jordan usually defended them. Tyrell has big ideas, he would say. He just hasn't had the right opportunity yet. I accepted the explanation because I trusted Jordan. More importantly, I wanted to trust Jordan. That's the uncomfortable truth many people avoid discussing. Once you emotionally invest in someone, you begin filtering reality through hope. Red flags start looking like misunderstandings. Doubts start looking like overthinking. Instincts start looking like fear. I was no different. Then one night, nearly 8 months into our relationship, Jordan took me to dinner at a restaurant overlooking the Chattahoochee River. The atmosphere was perfect. Soft music played in the background. Candles flickered on the tables. The city lights reflected across the water. Halfway through the evening, Jordan reached across the table and took my hand. The expression on his face looked serious, almost nervous. For a moment, I thought something was wrong. Then he smiled. "Charmaine," he said quietly, "I've spent my entire life looking for someone who shares my values, my vision, and my dreams. I don't want to imagine another future that doesn't include you." My heart started racing. Everything around us seemed to disappear. The restaurant, the music, the conversations. All of it faded into the background. Because in that moment, I genuinely believed I was about to receive everything I had been searching for since childhood. I had no idea that the answer I was about to give would place me on a path leading directly toward the most devastating betrayal of my life. The morning of my wedding began exactly the way I had imagined it would. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my suite, casting a warm glow across the room while makeup artists, photographers, and wedding coordinators moved around me with practiced efficiency. Everywhere I looked, people were smiling. The atmosphere felt electric. Months of planning had finally led to this day. Friends sent messages filled with congratulations. Colleagues who had flown in from different states were already arriving at the venue. Even my mother seemed unusually supportive. For the first time in a very long time, I allowed myself to believe everything had worked out exactly as it was supposed to. I wasn't just marrying Jordan. I was finally becoming part of a family. That thought stayed with me all morning. It followed me through every photograph, every toast, and every emotional conversation. By the time I stepped into my wedding dress, I felt something I rarely experienced: peace. Looking back now, that feeling almost hurts, because I had no idea it would disappear before the evening was over. The ceremony itself was beautiful. The venue overlooked a private lake just outside Atlanta. Hundreds of white roses lined the aisle. Soft music drifted through the air as guests settled into their seats. Nearly 200 people attended the event. Business leaders, friends, family members, community figures, and nonprofit partners filled the venue. Everything looked perfect. Jordan looked perfect. When I walked down the aisle and saw him waiting at the altar, I felt my eyes fill with tears. For a brief moment, every struggle from my past seemed worth it. Every lonely night, every sacrifice, every disappointment. They all felt like steps that had led me to this exact moment. The ceremony concluded without problems. Guests applauded. Photographers captured hundreds of images. Friends embraced us. Family members celebrated. To everyone watching, we looked like the definition of happiness. The reception began shortly afterward inside an elegant ballroom decorated with crystal chandeliers and breathtaking floral arrangements. The atmosphere was warm and joyful. Music played softly while guests enjoyed cocktails and conversation. People laughed, people danced, people celebrated. For nearly an hour, everything seemed normal. Then Dolores Banks stood up. At first, nobody thought anything of it. Parents often give speeches at weddings. In fact, several guests smiled as she approached the microphone near the center of the room. Dolores looked confident, proud, emotional. She waited patiently for conversations to quiet down before speaking. "I'd like to say a few words to our beautiful bride," she announced warmly. Guests applauded. Jordan smiled beside me. I smiled too. Why wouldn't I? At that moment, I genuinely believed she was about to welcome me into the family. Dolores began by talking about tradition. She described family values. She spoke about commitment, sacrifice, and responsibility. Everything sounded perfectly normal. Several guests nodded approvingly. Others raised glasses in support. The speech felt heartfelt. Then the tone changed. It happened so gradually that most people didn't notice at first. Dolores reached into a decorative folder she had brought to the podium and removed several sheets of paper. I remember thinking it was unusual. Most wedding speeches weren't written like business presentations. Still, I didn't worry. Not yet. "Every strong family needs structure," Dolores said. "And every successful marriage requires clear expectations." A few people chuckled politely. Jordan remained completely relaxed beside me. That detail would later become very important. Dolores continued speaking. "For generations, the Banks family has followed certain principles that help maintain unity and stability." The room grew quieter. Guests exchanged brief glances. Some appeared confused. Others seemed curious. I felt a small knot form in my stomach. Nothing dramatic, just a faint sense of discomfort. The kind of feeling people often ignore because they don't want to seem paranoid. Then Dolores looked directly at me and smiled. "Today, I'd like to formally introduce Charmaine to the Banks family directives for wives." The room fell silent. Complete silence. For several seconds, nobody reacted, because nobody understood what they had just heard. I certainly didn't. The phrase sounded bizarre, almost theatrical. I waited for someone to laugh. Nobody did. Dolores looked entirely serious. She lifted the first page and adjusted her glasses. "These guidelines have helped preserve the strength of our family for decades," she explained. My confusion deepened. Around the room, guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Several people glanced toward Jordan. Others looked at me. The atmosphere had changed, not dramatically. Not yet. But something felt wrong. Very wrong. I turned toward Jordan, expecting confusion, embarrassment, or concern. Instead, I found him smiling calmly. Not surprised, not uncomfortable, not confused, calm. The realization hit me like a sudden drop in temperature. Jordan knew about this. Whatever Dolores was doing, it wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't an emotional mistake. It wasn't an awkward joke. He knew. Before I could process that thought, Dolores continued. "Directive number 1, she announced proudly. The ballroom became so quiet that I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning system overhead. Every guest seemed frozen in place. Even the servers carrying trays had stopped moving. Dolores glanced down at the page and began reading. Upon entering the Banks family, a wife must prioritize her responsibilities to her husband and future children above all professional ambitions. My pulse quickened. The knot in my stomach tightened. Around the room, expressions shifted from confusion to disbelief. Yet Dolores continued as if she were reading something completely reasonable. Career achievements are temporary. Family responsibilities are permanent. I stared at her in shock. Surely this was the end of the statement. Surely she would laugh and reveal some kind of joke. Instead, she looked directly at me again. Therefore, the wife is expected to transition away from full-time professional employment and dedicate herself fully to supporting the household. For several seconds, I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I couldn't even process what I had just heard. Then I slowly turned toward Jordan, expecting him to stop this madness immediately. What happened next would change everything I thought I knew about the man standing beside me. For a moment, I genuinely believed Jordan was going to stop her. I expected him to laugh awkwardly, take the microphone away from his mother, and apologize to our guests. Any normal person would have done exactly that. Instead, Jordan remained perfectly calm. He didn't look embarrassed. He didn't look surprised. He didn't even look uncomfortable. He simply stood beside me with the same relaxed expression he had worn throughout the entire speech. That was the moment real fear began replacing confusion. Because if Jordan wasn't shocked, then he already knew what was happening. The realization hit me harder than anything Dolores had said. I stared at him, waiting for some sign that I was wrong, some indication that this was all a misunderstanding. Instead, he gave me a reassuring smile. A reassuring smile. In the middle of a public humiliation. "Jordan," I whispered. "What is this?" His response was immediate. "Just let her finish." My stomach dropped. Those 4 words changed everything, not because of what they said, but because of what they revealed. He wasn't trying to stop her. He was helping her. Around the ballroom, guests exchanged increasingly uncomfortable glances. The atmosphere that had once been joyful now felt tense and uncertain. Several people appeared unsure whether they should stay seated or quietly leave. Others seemed too shocked to move. Dolores, meanwhile, looked delighted by the attention. She straightened the papers in front of her and continued reading. "A successful marriage requires clearly defined responsibilities," she announced. "Modern society has unfortunately encouraged women to prioritize careers over families." I felt heat rising into my face. Every instinct told me to interrupt her, yet I couldn't fully comprehend what was happening. This was my wedding. My wedding. The event I had spent months planning and funding. The celebration that was supposed to mark the beginning of a new chapter. Somehow it had transformed into a public lecture about why my life choices were unacceptable. Dolores continued without hesitation. "Charmaine has achieved remarkable professional success," she said, "and we are proud of her accomplishments. However, once a woman joins the Banks family, her primary responsibility becomes supporting her husband and raising children." A wave of murmurs swept through the room. People were no longer hiding their reactions. Several guests openly stared at Dolores in disbelief. Others looked toward me with sympathy. One of my closest friends actually stood halfway out of her chair before her husband gently encouraged her to sit back down. Everyone could see how inappropriate this was becoming. Everyone except the people responsible for it. I looked at Jordan again. "Tell me she's joking." His jaw tightened slightly. "She's not joking." For a few seconds, I simply stared at him. Surely he couldn't mean that. Surely there was some explanation I wasn't understanding. "You agree with this?" I asked quietly. Jordan hesitated for less than a second. "I agree that families work best when priorities are clear." The words felt like a slap. Not because he shouted them, not because he sounded angry, but because he sounded sincere. Completely sincere. Suddenly, dozens of earlier conversations began replaying in my mind. The discussions about legacy, the comments about family responsibility, the repeated emphasis on traditional values, the subtle suggestions that success meant supporting people you loved. Individually, those conversations had seemed harmless. Standing there beside him, they started forming a completely different picture. Meanwhile, Dolores moved to the next section of her speech. Directive number 1 includes a structured transition period, she explained. During this adjustment, the wife should gradually step away from demanding professional obligations. Several guests laughed nervously, apparently convinced the speech had to be satire. Dolores ignored them. Within a reasonable time frame, employment should no longer interfere with family priorities. The laughter stopped. Nobody believed it was a joke anymore. I felt my pulse pounding in my ears. My entire career had been built through decades of sacrifice. Every promotion, every achievement, every opportunity. I had earned all of it. And now a woman who had contributed absolutely nothing to those accomplishments was standing in front of 200 guests, announcing that I should abandon everything. "This is insane," I said. Jordan's expression hardened slightly. It was the first glimpse of irritation I had ever seen from him. "Charmaine, don't make this bigger than it needs to be." I actually laughed. Not because anything was funny. Because I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Bigger than it needs to be?" I repeated. "Your mother is telling me to quit my job at my wedding." Several nearby guests nodded immediately. One older woman at a nearby table muttered, "She's right." Dolores ignored the reaction entirely. She seemed convinced she was delivering wisdom rather than destroying a marriage in real time. Then she lowered the papers and looked directly at me. "The Banks family simply believes that a wife should fully support her husband's leadership." Leadership. Another word that suddenly sounded very different than it had before. I turned toward Jordan one final time. This was his last opportunity. His last chance to stand beside me. His last chance to prove that the man I thought I loved actually existed. Instead, he calmly placed a hand on my shoulder and said something that instantly shattered whatever trust remained between us. "My mother only wants what's best for our future." In that moment, I finally stopped wondering whether this was a misunderstanding. Because misunderstandings don't happen by accident in front of 200 guests. Plans do. And for the first time all evening, I began to suspect that this entire performance had been planned long before I ever walked down that aisle. The moment I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding, everything around me began to look different. The ballroom was still beautiful. The chandeliers still sparkled overhead. Soft music still played through hidden speakers. Nearly 200 guests still sat at elegantly decorated tables, yet the atmosphere had changed completely. What had started as a wedding reception now felt like a public ambush. And the worst part was that the people responsible for it seemed convinced they were entitled to my obedience. After Jordan told me his mother only wanted what was best for our future, Dolores smiled as though she had just won an argument nobody else knew was happening. Then she lifted the next page from her folder. "Now that we've covered directive number 1, she announced confidently, "we can move on to financial stewardship." A chill ran through my body. Financial stewardship. The phrase sounded harmless enough, responsible, even. But something in her tone told me otherwise. Around the room, guests exchanged uneasy glances. People were no longer confused. They were concerned. Dolores looked down at the paper and began reading. "In order to protect family unity and ensure long-term prosperity, all significant financial assets should be managed through a centralized family structure." Several people frowned immediately. Others leaned forward in their chairs. The room had become completely silent again. Every word now felt important, dangerous. "Upon marriage," Dolores continued, "personal accounts, investment portfolios, and major properties should be incorporated into a unified family management plan under experienced supervision." My heart nearly stopped. For a moment I wondered if I had misunderstood her. Surely she couldn't mean what I thought she meant. Then she looked directly at me. "This allows financial decisions to benefit the entire family rather than a single individual." There it was. No misunderstanding. No confusion. No joke. She was openly discussing my money, my assets, my investments, my property, in front of 200 guests, as though they already belonged to her family. A shocked murmur spread through the ballroom. Several people actually laughed in disbelief. One executive from my company nearly choked on his drink. Another colleague stared at Dolores as if she had completely lost her mind. I turned toward Jordan again. Even then, part of me hoped he would stop this insanity. Instead, he simply folded his hands in front of him and listened. Calmly, patiently, almost approvingly. That reaction hurt more than anything his mother had said. Dolores continued reading. As the most financially experienced member of the family, I will initially oversee asset coordination and resource distribution. The room exploded with whispers. Guests were no longer trying to hide their reactions. Some looked horrified. Others looked fascinated. A few appeared genuinely entertained by the unfolding disaster. I could practically hear people asking themselves whether this was real. Unfortunately, it was very real. Asset coordination? I repeated. Resource distribution? Dolores nodded proudly. Exactly. The confidence in her voice was astonishing. A successful family shares responsibility and opportunity. My investment portfolio isn't a family opportunity, I said. It's mine. Her smile tightened slightly. The first crack in her pleasant grandmother act finally appeared. Not anymore, dear. The words hit the room like an explosion. Audible gasps echoed throughout the ballroom. Several guests physically turned in their chairs. Someone dropped a fork. Another person muttered, "Oh my God." Even now, I can remember the expression on people's faces. They weren't watching a wedding anymore. They were watching a train wreck. "Excuse me?" I asked. Dolores looked genuinely confused by my reaction. That was perhaps the most disturbing part of the entire encounter. She honestly believed she was being reasonable. Once you become part of a family, individual ownership becomes less important, she explained. Resources should serve everyone. Resources. She wasn't talking about money anymore. She was talking about my life, my future, my achievements, everything I had spent decades building. Suddenly, dozens of earlier conversations snapped into focus. The questions about my investments, the interest in my property, the discussions about family resources, the comments about supporting relatives. It all connected. Every single piece. This wasn't spontaneous. This wasn't an awkward wedding speech. This was the reveal. They had been building toward this moment for months. Then Tyrell made things worse. Much worse. Sitting at one of the front tables, he laughed and raised his glass. Honestly, this solves a lot of problems. The entire room turned toward him. Tyrell grinned. I've been telling Mom that Charmaine's financial planning is way better than anything the rest of us could put together. Several people stared at him in disbelief. He didn't seem to notice, or care. Imagine what we could accomplish if everything was finally organized together. Organized together. Another phrase that sounded harmless until you understood what it really meant. Tasha immediately jumped in. Exactly. Families are supposed to help each other. Then she smiled at me. Besides, you have more than enough. More than enough. The phrase made my blood boil. Nobody in that room knew how many nights I had sacrificed, how many weekends I had worked, how many years I had spent earning every dollar they were discussing so casually. To them, it wasn't the result of decades of effort. It was simply a pile of resources waiting to be redistributed. Jordan finally spoke. For one brief second, I hoped he was about to defend me. Instead, he delivered the sentence that erased any remaining doubt. Charmaine, he said calmly, nobody is trying to take anything from you. I stared at him. Your mother literally just announced a plan to control my assets. Jordan sighed as though I were being unreasonable. You're focusing on the wrong part. The wrong part. I almost laughed. The wrong part. Not the demand. Not the entitlement. Not the public humiliation. Apparently the problem was my reaction. Then explain the right part, I said. Jordan's expression remained perfectly calm. We're talking about building a future together. Future. Family. Legacy. Support. Resource sharing. Suddenly, every word he had repeated throughout our relationship sounded completely different. The language hadn't changed, the meaning had, and for the first time since the speech began, I stopped seeing Jordan as the man I loved. I started seeing him as someone I didn't recognize at all. Then Dolores lifted another page from the folder and smiled. Excellent, she said. Now that we've clarified financial responsibilities, let's discuss property ownership. And that was the moment I realized things were about to become far worse than I had imagined. Property ownership. The moment those words left Dolores's mouth, the last illusion I had been holding on to finally cracked. Until then, a small part of me had still been searching for a reasonable explanation. Maybe this was some bizarre family tradition. Maybe it was an incredibly inappropriate joke that had spiraled out of control. Maybe Jordan would eventually step in and stop the madness. But when Dolores announced that the next topic was property ownership, I realized something horrifying. They weren't improvising. They were following a plan, a detailed plan, a plan that had clearly been discussed long before our wedding day. The ballroom had become eerily quiet. Even the servers had stopped moving. Every guest seemed frozen in place, watching a disaster unfold in real time. Dolores looked completely comfortable standing at the microphone. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't embarrassed. She wasn't worried about how any of this looked. That confidence told me everything I needed to know. She had expected cooperation. She had expected compliance. Most importantly, she had expected Jordan to support her. And judging by his behavior, she had every reason to believe he would. Dolores adjusted the papers in her folder and smiled warmly. It was the same smile she had used throughout our engagement, the same smile she wore during family dinners, the same smile she wore every time she called me her future daughter-in-law. Only now I could see something behind it. Calculation. A family home should benefit the family, she said, not just the individual whose name happens to be on the paperwork. Several people in the audience actually groaned. Others exchanged looks of disbelief. Yet Dolores continued as if she were delivering timeless wisdom. Properties should be utilized according to the needs of the family unit. Utilized. The word landed heavily in my chest. Because I already knew which property she was talking about. There was only one asset anyone in that family truly cared about. My villa. The home I had purchased years before Jordan entered my life. The home I had paid for entirely on my own. The home they had spent months asking questions about. Then Dolores finally said it. Charmaine's beautiful home represents an incredible opportunity for family growth and support. There it was. No more pretending. No more subtle hints. No more carefully disguised conversations. The target had finally been named. A wave of whispers spread through the ballroom. Guests looked stunned. Some appeared genuinely angry on my behalf. Others seemed unable to believe what they were hearing. I couldn't blame them. If someone had described this situation to me 6 months earlier, I probably wouldn't have believed it either. Then Tyrell leaned forward in his chair. Honestly, the place is big enough for everyone. The comment triggered immediate laughter from several guests. Not because it was funny, because it was absurd. Unfortunately, Tyrell wasn't joking. I've already told Jordan that the office wing would be perfect for a business operation. My stomach tightened. Office wing, business operation. Those weren't hypothetical statements. They sounded like conversations that had already happened. I slowly turned toward Jordan. He avoided eye contact. Just for a second. But it was enough. That brief hesitation told me more than any explanation ever could. Tyrell continued speaking. With the right setup, I could finally scale some of my projects. Scale his projects. The same projects that never seemed to generate actual income. The same projects that existed mostly in conversations and promises. Across the table, Tasha laughed excitedly. And the guest suite overlooking the garden is definitely mine. More nervous laughter echoed through the ballroom. Again, they seemed completely oblivious to how insane they sounded. Tasha smiled at me as though we were discussing vacation plans. I've loved that room since the first time I saw it. Loved that room, in my house, the house she apparently believed she would soon occupy. At that moment, dozens of strange memories suddenly became crystal clear. The endless questions about guest rooms, the fascination with square footage, the conversations that mysteriously stopped whenever I entered a room, the comments nobody corrected, the assumptions nobody challenged. They weren't imagining possibilities. They were discussing expectations. Somewhere along the way, this family had convinced themselves that my property would eventually become theirs, and Jordan knew it. That realization hurt more than anything else. Not the greed, not the entitlement. Jordan. The man who had sat beside me for months. The man who had listened to stories about my childhood. The man who knew exactly how hard I had worked for everything I owned. He had watched this happen. He had allowed it to happen. Maybe he had even encouraged it. Jordan, I said quietly, tell me they're joking. The room went silent again. Everyone was watching him now. Not Dolores, not Tyrell, not Tasha, him. Because this was the moment that mattered. This was the moment when a husband chose his wife or his family. Jordan exhaled slowly. For a brief second, I saw conflict in his eyes. Then it disappeared. They're just thinking about the future. The disappointment I felt in that moment is difficult to describe. Not because of what he said, because of what he didn't say. He didn't defend me. He didn't defend my ownership. He didn't tell his family they were out of line. He didn't tell them the house belonged to me. Instead, he validated the conversation. He legitimized it. He transformed a ridiculous fantasy into something worthy of discussion. The future? I repeated. They're assigning themselves rooms in my house. Jordan's expression hardened. Our house. The room exploded. Audible gasps erupted from multiple tables. Someone actually said, "Wow." Another guest muttered something far less polite, but I barely heard any of it. My attention was locked on Jordan. Our house. 2 words. 2 simple words. Yet they revealed more truth than months of conversation ever had. The villa had never been viewed as my achievement. It had never been viewed as my property. It had been viewed as an acquisition, a prize, something waiting to be absorbed into the Banks family empire. Suddenly, every warning sign from the past year assembled itself into a complete picture. The questions, the assumptions, the entitlement, the constant discussions about family resources. None of it had been accidental. None of it. Then Jordan looked directly at me and delivered the sentence that finally destroyed whatever remained of the man I thought I was marrying. "Charmaine, after today, what's yours is supposed to become ours." The words echoed through the ballroom. For everyone else, they sounded controlling. For me, they sounded like a confession. Because for the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't hearing what Jordan was saying. I was hearing what he had been hiding. And what I was beginning to understand terrified me far more than anything his mother had read from that folder. The words, "What's yours is supposed to become ours," seemed to hang above the entire ballroom like smoke from a fire nobody could put out. For several seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even Dolores looked pleased with herself, as though Jordan had finally said the quiet part out loud. That was when I understood the real purpose of her ridiculous directives. This was never about tradition. It was never about family values. It was never about marriage. It was a transfer of ownership disguised as a wedding celebration. And once Jordan said those words, Tyrell and Tasha no longer felt the need to pretend either. Tyrell rose from his seat with a slow, confident smile. He adjusted the lapels of his rented tuxedo as if he were preparing to make an executive decision instead of publicly exposing his own entitlement. "Jordan's right," he said. "A marriage isn't supposed to be separate accounts and separate houses. That's how selfish people live." Several guests immediately turned toward him with visible disgust. Tyrell ignored them. He had the posture of a man who believed volume could replace credibility. "Family means everybody pulls together. And honestly, Charmaine, that house of yours has way too much unused space for one couple." My jaw tightened. That house of yours. Even while arguing that it belonged to everyone, he still couldn't hide the envy in his voice. Tasha stood beside him before I could respond. She had been waiting for this moment. I could see it in the way her eyes sharpened and her shoulders straightened. "Exactly," she said, lifting her chin. "Do you know how many families would be grateful to have that kind of space? But you just walk around in all those empty rooms like it's normal." Her tone carried a bitterness I had never noticed so clearly before. It wasn't moral outrage, it was jealousy wearing a cheap costume. "Tasha," I said slowly, "you have been inside my home twice." She smiled, and the expression made my skin crawl. "3 times, actually." The room went cold. I stared at her. "What did you just say?" For the first time all night, Jordan shifted uncomfortably beside me. Not enough for most people to notice. But I noticed. Tasha, however, seemed too excited by her own victory to recognize the danger. "Oh, don't act shocked," she said with a dismissive wave. "Jordan let us stop by while you were traveling last month. He said it was fine because we were going to be family soon." My body went completely still. I remembered that trip immediately. I had been in Chicago for 3 days, finalizing an acquisition. Jordan had stayed behind in Atlanta because he claimed he had a nonprofit board meeting. At the time, I hadn't questioned it. I trusted him. I trusted the security codes. I trusted the house. I trusted him with every locked door in my life. And now Tasha was telling me he had opened those doors for people who were already planning how to use what was mine. Jordan, I said, without looking away from Tasha. Is that true? He didn't answer quickly enough. That hesitation told me everything. It wasn't a big deal, he finally said. They wanted to see the place. A low sound moved through the crowd, half gasp, half disbelief. One of my colleagues leaned back in his chair with his hand over his mouth. Another whispered something to the woman beside him. They understood exactly what Jordan had admitted. He hadn't simply shown family members a house. He had violated private property, personal trust, and physical safety. Tasha continued, apparently mistaking my silence for weakness. Anyway, the upstairs guest suite is perfect for the kids. The one with the garden view. It gets the best morning light. She said it casually, as though she were discussing a hotel reservation. The kids? I repeated. Yes, she said, almost impatiently. Our lease situation has become complicated, and Jordan said we could stay until things settle. Tyrell cleared his throat, clearly annoyed that she had revealed more than he intended. Temporarily, he said. Just until we restructure some things financially. Restructure. Another corporate-sounding word used to hide irresponsibility. I looked from Tyrell to Jordan. You offered them rooms in my house? Jordan's face tightened. I said we would talk about it after the wedding. That is not what you told us, Tasha snapped. The entire room shifted. Suddenly the argument wasn't just between me and Jordan. Their own lies were beginning to collide. Tasha turned toward him, irritated. You said once the marriage was official, she would have to understand family obligations. Official. The word pierced through my anger and landed somewhere much deeper. Once the marriage was official. It was a small phrase, but it lodged itself in my mind. At that exact moment, I didn't yet understand how important it would become. I only knew something about it felt strange. Because technically, despite the ceremony, our legal appointment with the judge was scheduled for the next morning. We had arranged it that way for privacy and paperwork reasons after my attorney insisted certain documents be reviewed before final filing. I had barely thought about it during the wedding planning chaos. To me, the ceremony was the emotional commitment. The legal signing was a formality, but the way Tasha said official made it sound like a gate opening, a switch being flipped, a trap being completed. Tyrell quickly stepped forward, trying to regain control. Look, this is getting twisted, he said. Nobody is stealing anything. We are talking about using available family space in a practical way. My home is not available family space, I said. Tyrell's mouth curled into a humorless smile. That's exactly the kind of attitude Dolores was talking about. You still think like a single woman. The insult was deliberate, public, designed to shame me. Tasha nodded eagerly. A wife doesn't keep walls around everything. A wife opens her home. My home, I corrected. Our family home, Tasha shot back. Then she made the mistake that pushed the entire situation from outrageous into unforgivable. She smiled in front of 200 guests and said, Don't worry. I already made a list of what needs changing before we move in. For one full second, nobody reacted. The statement was too insane to process. Then whispers erupted across the ballroom. Tasha lifted her hand and started counting on her fingers. The guest bathroom upstairs is too dark. Those marble tiles are depressing. The closet system in that suite won't work for children's clothes. And that office on the main floor is honestly wasted on one person. Tyrell immediately jumped in. She's right about the office. I could turn that into a proper trading setup. I stared at him. A trading setup? Yes, he said proudly. Crypto, commodities, some private investment work. I need multiple screens and quiet. Your office already has the perfect infrastructure. Your office, my equipment, my desk, my private files, my professional space. Discussed like abandoned furniture, Tasha added. You won't need it much anyway once you slow down at work. There it was. The connection between every directive. Quit working. Hand over the money. Surrender the house. Serve the family. Each piece supported the next. Each demand made the others easier to enforce. They weren't asking me to become a wife. They were asking me to become a resource. I looked at Jordan, waiting for him to finally realize how monstrous this sounded. Instead, he avoided my eyes again. That avoidance was the loudest confession in the room. Charmaine, he said quietly, they're going through a hard time. a hard time, as though hardship entitled them to my life, as though their poor decisions gave them ownership over my labor, as though compassion required surrender. I took a slow breath, trying to keep my voice steady. And you decided my home was the solution? Jordan's expression darkened. I decided that marriage means we don't act like strangers when family needs help. He said it firmly, publicly, with the confidence of a man who believed guilt could still control the room. But the room had changed. People were no longer looking at me with confusion. They were looking at him with horror. Tasha crossed her arms. We already told our babysitter we might be moving soon, Terrell added, and I have equipment coming next week. The entitlement was so complete, so brazen, that my shock began cooling into something sharper. Clarity. They had entered my wedding reception expecting to leave with access to my money, my career, and my house. Not someday, immediately, and Jordan had been helping them measure the cage before they closed the door. I looked at my almost husband, then at his mother, then at his brother and sister-in-law standing proudly in front of guests who were now witnessing the truth spill out piece by piece. For the first time that night, I stopped feeling embarrassed. I stopped feeling confused. I stopped feeling hurt. And I started feeling dangerous. Because people like the Banks family always make one fatal mistake. They assume kindness means weakness, and they never recognize the exact moment a woman decides she is done being hunted. The moment Tasha finished speaking, something inside me changed. Not dramatically, not visibly. Nobody in that ballroom could have pointed to the exact second it happened. But it happened. Up until then, I had been reacting, trying to understand, trying to rationalize, trying to convince myself there had to be some explanation that would make this nightmare make sense. Then Tasha proudly announced she had already planned renovations for my house, and the final piece fell into place. Suddenly, everything became clear. The strange questions, the awkward comments, the obsession with my property, the endless conversations about family resources, the requests disguised as values, the expectations disguised as traditions. They weren't individual incidents. They were pieces of the same puzzle. And for the first time since Dolores picked up that microphone, I stopped seeing random behavior and started seeing a coordinated plan. Standing there in my wedding dress, surrounded by nearly 200 guests, I began mentally replaying the previous year of my life. The first family dinner, the questions about my home, the repeated discussions about financial unity, the fascination with my career, the comments about legacy, the assumptions about shared resources. One memory after another surfaced, each one insignificant on its own. Together they painted a picture so obvious I almost felt foolish for missing it. I remembered the afternoon Dolores toured my villa and spent more time asking about property taxes than the actual architecture. I remembered Tyrell studying my office with unusual interest. I remembered Tasha joking about guest rooms as though she were choosing furniture from a catalog. Most importantly, I remembered Jordan defending every strange moment, every single one. Whenever something felt unusual, Jordan had an explanation. Whenever someone crossed a boundary, Jordan minimized it. Whenever I felt uncomfortable, Jordan reassured me. At the time, I thought he was protecting family harmony. Now I realized he had been protecting something else entirely, the plan. A cold realization settled over me. None of this had started at the wedding. The wedding was simply the reveal. The real operation had begun months earlier, perhaps even before our engagement. The thought should have devastated me. Instead, it made me strangely calm. Anger often creates clarity. Once I stopped trying to save the relationship, I could finally see it. Across the ballroom, Jordan was still watching me carefully. He knew me well enough to recognize the difference between panic and calculation. Earlier that evening, he had expected tears. He had expected emotional reactions. He had expected confusion. What he was seeing now was something else entirely. And for the first time all night, he looked slightly nervous. Dolores noticed it too. She immediately stepped back into the conversation, clearly trying to regain control. "Nobody is attacking you, Charmaine," she said in a patient tone usually reserved for children. "We're discussing family cooperation. Family cooperation." The phrase almost made me laugh. "Family cooperation usually requires consent," I replied. A few guests nodded immediately. Others quietly applauded. The shift in the room was becoming impossible to ignore. Earlier, People had been uncomfortable. Now they were openly siding with me. Dolores noticed that as well. Her smile tightened. Not much. Just enough. For months, I had seen her as a warm, welcoming woman. Standing there now, I was finally seeing the version hidden underneath. The woman who believed entitlement was wisdom. The woman who believed other people's success belonged to whoever wanted it badly enough. "You're looking at this emotionally," Dolores said. "No," I answered. "I'm looking at it legally." The effect was immediate. Jordan's expression changed, very slightly, but I caught it. For the first time that evening, his confidence flickered. The reaction lasted less than a second before disappearing. Most people would have missed it. I didn't. Something about the word legally bothered him. That detail quietly lodged itself in the back of my mind. Meanwhile, Tyrell attempted to regain momentum. "Nobody's trying to steal anything," he said. "We're talking about building generational wealth." Generational wealth. Another phrase. Another disguise. Another attempt to wrap greed inside respectable language. "Using my assets," I replied. "Using family assets," Tyrell corrected. There it was again. The assumption. Not a request. Not a proposal. An assumption. Somewhere along the way, they had stopped viewing my property as mine. That kind of confidence doesn't appear overnight. It comes from repeated discussions, repeated promises, repeated expectations, which meant one thing. Jordan had been talking to them. A lot. The realization struck harder than anything else, because betrayal hurts most when it requires preparation. Random cruelty is painful. Planned cruelty is personal. I looked around the ballroom. Nearly every guest seemed to understand exactly what was happening now. Conversations had stopped completely. Nobody cared about the reception anymore. Nobody cared about dinner. Nobody cared about dancing. They were watching the truth emerge piece by piece. Then another memory surfaced. Small, almost insignificant. A meeting with my attorney several months earlier. We had been reviewing estate planning documents connected to the marriage. During that conversation, he had recommended delaying the official legal filing until several final reviews were completed. The ceremony and reception could proceed as planned, but the legal registration would take place afterward. At the time, it seemed like routine paperwork. Now the memory felt strangely important. I didn't fully understand why yet. I only knew that Jordan had strongly questioned the delay, not publicly, not aggressively, but he had questioned it. He had wanted everything completed as quickly as possible. Why? The question lingered in my mind. Then another memory followed. A conversation during wedding planning. Jordan asking detailed questions about joint accounts. Another discussion about beneficiary structures. Another about property access. Individually, none of those topics seemed suspicious. Together, they suddenly looked very different. They looked like information gathering. They looked like preparation. And if I was right, then the people standing in front of me weren't improvising. They had expected tonight to end with complete control over my future. Dolores cleared her throat. "The sooner we move past this misunderstanding, the sooner we can celebrate." Celebrate. The word sounded absurd. There would be no celebration. Not after this. Not after what they had revealed. For the first time all evening, I wasn't focused on what they wanted. I was focused on what they had already exposed, because people who believe they've won become careless, and careless people reveal things. Tyrell had revealed the house. Tasha had revealed the moving plans. Dolores had revealed the financial expectations. Jordan had revealed his loyalty. Piece by piece, they were dismantling their own masks, and the more they talked, the more certain I became of one thing. This family had spent months studying my assets. What they had failed to study was me. Because while they were busy imagining how they would divide my life among themselves, they had overlooked a simple fact. I had built that life by surviving people far smarter and far more dangerous than them. And if they thought this wedding was the end of the negotiation, they were about to discover it had only just begun. By the time I realized the negotiation wasn't over, I had already made a decision. I needed answers. Not assumptions. Not suspicions. Answers. The ballroom had become a battlefield disguised as a wedding reception, and every second that passed revealed another layer of deception. But there was one person whose explanation mattered more than anyone else's: Jordan. Because if I was right about what had happened, then everything started and ended with him. I slowly turned toward him. "Come with me." My voice was calm. That surprised him. Earlier, he had expected anger, then tears, then emotional surrender. Calm was not part of the plan. "Charmaine, now." The firmness in my voice immediately silenced him. Around the ballroom, guests watched closely as I walked toward a private conference room connected to the reception hall. Jordan hesitated for a moment before following. Behind us, the room erupted into whispers. Nobody cared about the wedding anymore. They cared about what was happening behind that door. The moment it closed, the atmosphere changed completely. No audience, no family members, no microphones, just the two of us. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Jordan loosened his tie and exhaled heavily. He looked irritated. Not guilty. Irritated. That detail mattered. People who know they've been caught usually show fear. Jordan seemed frustrated that I wasn't cooperating. "You're making this much worse than it needs to be," he finally said. I actually laughed. Not because anything was funny, because the statement was unbelievable. "Your family just tried to claim my career, my finances, and my home in front of 200 people. That's not what happened." "Then explain what happened." Jordan rubbed his forehead. "My family is traditional." Traditional. The word felt almost insulting. "Traditional people don't assign themselves rooms in someone else's house." His jaw tightened. "You are focusing on the delivery instead of the message." There it was again. The same strategy. Minimize the behavior. Redirect the conversation. Make my reaction the problem. It suddenly became obvious why he had been so effective throughout our relationship. He wasn't just persuasive, he was practiced. "Fine," I said. "Let's talk about the message." Jordan relaxed slightly. He thought he was regaining control. "Good." I folded my arms. "Explain why your mother believes she should manage my investments." His confidence returned immediately. "Because she has experience coordinating family finances." I stared at him. "My portfolio is worth several $1,000,000. "Exactly." I blinked. "Exactly? That's exactly why proper oversight matters." The room went silent. For a moment, I genuinely wondered if I had misheard him. Then I realized I hadn't. Jordan wasn't trying to hide his position anymore. He actually believed this. Or at least he wanted me to believe he did. "Oversight?" I repeated. "You think I need oversight?" "I think successful families create systems." His tone remained calm, almost professional, like a consultant presenting a business strategy. "Jordan, I've spent 15 years building my career, and nobody is taking that away. Your mother literally announced that I should leave it. Eventually." The word hit me like a punch. Eventually. Not never. Eventually. Not a misunderstanding. A timeline. "Eventually?" Jordan sighed. "Charmaine, do you really think it's sustainable to work 80-hour weeks forever?" I stared at him. "So this was always the plan?" For the first time, he didn't answer immediately. That hesitation told me more than any confession ever could. "We talked about family priorities." "No. You talked about family priorities. You never mentioned quitting my career." Jordan's patience began slipping. "Because every time the subject came up, you became defensive." I laughed again. Defensive? About my own life? About compromise. There it was. The real word. Compromise. Except compromise requires both sides to sacrifice something. So far, the only sacrifices being discussed belong to me. My career. My assets. My home. My independence. My future. "What exactly are you sacrificing?" I asked. Jordan frowned. "That's not fair." "Answer the question." Silence. Complete silence. Because there was no answer. He wasn't giving anything up. Neither was his family. They were gaining. Every single part of the arrangement benefited them. Then something shifted in Jordan's expression. The calm mask he'd worn all evening started slipping. For the first time, irritation became visible. "Do you know what your problem is?" he asked. I almost smiled. Whenever someone says that, they're usually about to reveal far more about themselves than the other person. "Please, tell me." "You've spent so long being successful that you've forgotten how relationships work." There it was, the resentment, hidden beneath months of support and encouragement. Relationships? I asked. Or control? Partnership? Then why does every partnership benefit your family? His eyes narrowed. Because family matters. My family matters too. Your family isn't struggling. And there it was. The truth. Not all of it, but enough. His family wasn't discussing principles. They were discussing need. The entire conversation had been about solving their problems using my resources. Jordan immediately realized what he had revealed. His expression tightened. Too late. I had heard it. So that's what this is really about? I asked quietly. Helping family. With my money. Our money. There it was again. Our. Always our. Never mine. Never earned. Never built. Just absorbed. Claimed. Reassigned. Suddenly I remembered every conversation about legacy. Every discussion about supporting relatives. Every speech about responsibility. None of those conversations had been philosophical. They had been preparation. Then Jordan made a mistake. A huge mistake. He became honest. Maybe he was frustrated. Maybe he thought I was already trapped. Maybe he genuinely believed I would eventually accept it. Whatever the reason, he finally stopped hiding. You don't understand what it's like, he said. My family has spent years struggling while you sit alone in a house big enough for 10 people. I stared at him. There it is. What? The truth. Jordan looked away. You know I'm right. No, I know you're jealous. His head snapped back toward me. The reaction was immediate, emotional, raw, accurate. For the first time all evening, I saw the real Jordan Banks. Not the patient nonprofit director, not the supportive fiancé, the man underneath, the man who had spent months smiling while quietly resenting everything I had built. You think everything was handed to you? He snapped. I earned everything I have. You had opportunities. I created opportunities. Not everyone gets your advantages. I laughed in disbelief. Advantages. The daughter who spent her childhood chasing approval. The woman who worked herself into exhaustion. The executive who sacrificed relationships, weekends, and sleep to build a career. Advantages. Jordan wasn't just jealous. He had rewritten reality in his head. That was the moment I understood something terrifying. He genuinely believed he was justified. People like Jordan are dangerous because they don't see themselves as villains. They see themselves as victims collecting what they deserve. Then he delivered the sentence that destroyed whatever remained of our relationship. After tomorrow, none of this would even be a problem. Tomorrow. Not today. Tomorrow. My mind immediately caught the detail. The legal signing. The paperwork. The official registration. Suddenly, every instinct I had been ignoring started screaming. Jordan saw the realization in my eyes and immediately regretted speaking. But it was too late. I stepped closer. What happens tomorrow, Jordan? He didn't answer. What exactly changes tomorrow? Silence. Why are you so focused on tomorrow? His face went completely blank. And in that silence, I finally got the answer I needed. Because guilty people often confess without saying a single word. I looked at the man I was supposed to spend the rest of my life with and realized something horrifying. This wasn't a disagreement about family values. This wasn't a misunderstanding about expectations. This wasn't even about love anymore. This was a transaction. And for months, Jordan Banks had been preparing to collect payment. The moment I understood what Jordan had been preparing for, something unexpected happened. I stopped feeling emotional. The anger remained, the betrayal remained, the disappointment remained, but they were no longer in control. For most of the evening, I had been reacting to information. Now I finally had enough information to act. Jordan must have noticed the change because his confidence suddenly disappeared. Up until that point, he had spoken like a man negotiating terms. Now he looked like a man realizing the negotiation might be over. Charmaine, he said carefully, you're taking this in the worst possible way. I almost smiled. The worst possible way. As though there were a better interpretation of what had happened. As though there was a version of reality where his family demanding my career, my assets, and my house somehow represented love. No, I replied calmly. For the first time all night, I'm seeing it exactly the way it is. Jordan opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. He knew it wouldn't work anymore. The explanations were finished. The justifications were finished. The performance was finished. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I asked the question that mattered most. How long? His expression tightened immediately. What? How long has your family been planning this? Jordan looked away. That was answer enough. Jordan. He exhaled slowly. It's not like that. Then answer me. More silence. Every second made the truth clearer. Innocent people answer questions. Guilty people search for wording. Finally, he spoke. My family had concerns. Concerns. Another carefully selected word. About what? About whether our future was structured properly. I laughed in disbelief. Structured properly? You own everything. There it was. No disguise. No euphemism. No family values speech. Just resentment. Raw and obvious. I stared at him. I own everything because I earned everything. Marriage changes things. Marriage doesn't erase ownership. His jaw tightened. Maybe that's how you see it. And suddenly I understood something important. Jordan wasn't trying to build a partnership. He was trying to correct what he viewed as an imbalance. In his mind, my success wasn't something to admire. It was something to redistribute. My independence wasn't something to respect. It was something to control. The realization made everything else make sense. Every conversation, every family gathering, every strange comment. They had never been preparing for a marriage. They had been preparing for an acquisition. I looked directly into his eyes. Did you ever love me? The question hit him harder than I expected. For the first time all evening, genuine emotion crossed his face. Not guilt, not remorse, discomfort. Of course I did. Did. Not do. Did. Even his tense changed. I noticed it immediately. He noticed it too. I mean do. Too late. The damage was done. That's not what I asked. Jordan ran a hand through his hair. Why are we talking about this? Because I need to know whether any of it was real. His silence lasted just long enough to hurt. Not because I needed his validation. Because I already knew the answer before he spoke. It was real, he finally said. At first. At first. Those two words ended everything. There are moments in life when a relationship dies so completely that you can almost hear the sound. That was one of them. At first. Meaning something changed. Meaning the woman mattered until the assets became more important. Meaning the relationship slowly transformed into a financial strategy. Jordan immediately realized what he had admitted. His eyes widened slightly. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? He couldn't answer. Because there was no answer that improved what he had already revealed. I nodded slowly. The sadness surprised me. Not because I still wanted him. Because I finally understood that the person I loved had never truly existed. He had been partially real. Partially performance. And I had spent months loving the version designed for me to see. Then Jordan made one final mistake. He underestimated me. Look, he said. The situation isn't ideal, but we can still fix this. Fix this. I stared at him. You think we're fixing this? If you calm down and talk to my family. I laughed so hard I had to look away. The sound actually startled him. You still don't understand, do you? Understand what? For the first time that night, I felt completely in control. You think the problem is that I'm upset? Jordan frowned. Isn't it? No. I stepped closer. The problem is that your family just exposed themselves in front of 200 witnesses. His expression changed instantly. There it was. Fear. Finally. Not fear for the relationship. Fear for the consequences. Because he suddenly realized something important. Nearly every influential person in my life was sitting in that ballroom. Executives. Attorneys. Financial advisors. Business owners. People trained to recognize manipulation and fraud. People who had just spent the last hour listening to his family describe a roadmap for taking control of another person's assets. Jordan swallowed hard. Charmaine. No. Listen carefully. My voice remained calm. That calmness frightened him more than shouting ever could. Tonight, your mother revealed exactly what she wants. Your brother revealed exactly what he expects. Your sister-in-law revealed exactly what she planned. And you revealed exactly who you are. Jordan's face went pale. He finally understood. This wasn't a private argument anymore. It was evidence. Public evidence. Then I reached for the conference room door. "Where are you going?" he asked. I paused. Back to the reception. Why? For the first time all evening, Jordan sounded nervous. Genuinely nervous. I looked directly at him. "Because your family spent months planning how to divide my life." I opened the door. "And now I'm going to show them what happens when they underestimate the person who built it." Then I stepped back into the ballroom, and for the first time that night, I wasn't returning as the bride. I was returning as the most dangerous person in the room. The moment I stepped back into the ballroom, every conversation stopped. Nearly 200 people turned toward me at once. The room that had been filled with whispers only seconds earlier became completely silent. Jordan emerged from the conference room several steps behind me, and that silence somehow grew heavier. People didn't need to hear our conversation to know something had changed. They could see it. The uncertainty was gone. The confusion was gone. Whatever vulnerability I had walked into that room with had been left behind. Dolores noticed it immediately. Her confident smile faltered for the first time all evening. Not completely, just enough. The expression reminded me of a poker player realizing someone else might be holding a better hand. I walked directly toward the center of the ballroom. Every step felt deliberate, controlled. The closer I moved toward the microphone, the more nervous the Banks family became. Tyrell shifted in his chair. Tasha crossed her arms. Jordan remained motionless. Dolores attempted a smile. "There she is," she said brightly. "Now that we've all had a chance to calm down, I'd like the microphone." The interruption landed harder than I expected. Dolores blinked. "Excuse me?" "The microphone." For several seconds, nobody moved. Then one of the event coordinators quietly handed it to me. Dolores looked irritated but stepped aside. She still believed she could regain control of the situation. That assumption would prove costly. I turned slowly, taking in the room. Friends, colleagues, business associates, family members, people who had known me for years, people who had watched me build my career, people who had just witnessed one of the strangest wedding receptions in human history. "Thank you all for staying," I began. A few nervous laughs moved through the audience. Good. That meant they were listening. "I know tonight has been unexpected." More laughter, this time louder. Even several guests who looked horrified couldn't help smiling. The tension shifted slightly. Not gone, just redirected. Then I looked directly at Dolores. "My future mother-in-law has spent the last hour explaining what she believes should happen to my career, my finances, and my property." Dolores folded her arms. "Because somebody needs to." The room groaned collectively. I almost thanked her. Every time she spoke, she made my job easier. "Interesting," I replied. "Because that raises an important question." I turned back toward the audience. If someone wants control over another person's assets, shouldn't they demonstrate that they're capable of managing their own? The room became quiet again. Dolores's expression froze. Jordan looked up sharply. Tyrell frowned. Tasha suddenly appeared uncomfortable. Good. For the first time all evening, the conversation was moving in the correct direction. "Let's start with something simple," I said. "Dolores, how many mortgage payments have you missed this year?" The effect was immediate, complete shock. Dolores's face lost color so quickly it was almost visible. Several guests gasped. Others looked back and forth between us. Jordan took a step forward. "Charmaine." "No." I held up a hand. "Let's have an honest conversation. That's what family does, right?" A ripple of laughter moved through the ballroom. This time it wasn't nervous, it was entertained. Dolores looked furious. "That is none of their business." "Really?" I asked. "Because my investment accounts apparently became everyone's business about 20 minutes ago." More laughter. Louder now. The audience was beginning to understand what was happening. For the first time all evening, someone was pushing back. "3 payments," I continued. "That's how many mortgage payments you've missed in the last 12 months. Silence. Absolute silence. Jordan looked horrified. Tyrell stared at the floor. Tasha suddenly found the centerpiece extremely interesting. Nobody denied it. That told the room everything. "In fact," I continued, "unless something changes very soon, Your lender intends to begin foreclosure proceedings. A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. Several people physically turned toward Dolores. Her face had gone completely pale. Gone was the confident family matriarch. Gone was the woman lecturing everyone about financial stewardship. What remained was someone desperately hoping the ground would open beneath her feet. "That's a lie," she snapped. Her voice cracked slightly. "A mistake. The strongest lies are delivered calmly. Panic makes people suspicious." "Is it?" I asked. "Then I'm sure you'd have no objection to discussing the notices sent to your home during the last 6 months." She didn't answer. The silence was devastating. One by one, guests began piecing things together. The woman who wanted control of my portfolio couldn't manage her own mortgage. The woman who wanted authority over my assets was losing her own home. The hypocrisy was almost too obvious. Then I delivered the line that truly changed the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to clarify something. Dolores doesn't want access to my finances because she's successful. She wants access to my finances because she's desperate." The reaction was explosive. Audible gasps, whispered conversations. Several people openly shook their heads. Even guests who barely knew me looked disgusted, because everyone understood the difference between needing help and disguising that need as entitlement. Jordan stepped forward again. "This isn't necessary." "Actually," I replied, "it's exactly necessary." Then I looked directly at Dolores. "You stood in front of 200 people and announced that I needed supervision. Let's talk about supervision. How much credit card debt are you carrying right now?" The color drained from her face completely. She knew the answer. More importantly, she knew I knew the answer. "Charmaine," Jordan warned. I ignored him. $37,000. Another wave of shock hit the room. Some guests actually laughed in disbelief. Others stared openly. The image Dolores had carefully built throughout the evening was collapsing piece by piece. Every statement she made about responsibility now sounded ridiculous. Every lecture sounded hypocritical. Every demand sounded self-serving. And I wasn't finished. Not even close. Because while Dolores had spent the last hour trying to convince everyone that I needed guidance, she had forgotten a simple fact. I work in acquisitions. Due diligence is practically a religion in my industry. Whenever someone enters my life, especially someone connected to major financial decisions, information gets reviewed, backgrounds get checked, public records get examined, patterns get noticed. The bank's family had spent months studying my assets. What they never realized was that I had unintentionally learned far more about them than they had ever imagined. I slowly turned toward Tyrell. The moment our eyes met, his confidence disappeared. And judging by the look on his face, he already knew exactly what was coming next. The moment I looked at Tyrell, he stopped pretending to be relaxed. Until then, he had spent most of the evening leaning back in his chair, smirking whenever someone mentioned family, resources, or my house. That confidence vanished instantly. Unlike Dolores, who still believed she could talk her way out of trouble, Tyrell understood something important. I wasn't guessing. I wasn't bluffing. And if I knew about his mother's finances, there was a very good chance I knew about his too. "Charmaine," he said with a forced laugh, "whatever this is, I think we've all had enough drama for one night." The audience laughed immediately. Not with him. At him. Because after everything that had happened, nobody was interested in ending the drama. They wanted the truth. I smiled politely. "That's interesting coming from someone who spent the last 30 minutes discussing where he planned to put his trading operation inside my office." More laughter swept through the ballroom. Tyrell's jaw tightened. "That was a joke." "No," I replied. "It wasn't." Silence. "You weren't joking because you've been looking for a place to run that operation ever since your landlord informed you he wasn't renewing your lease." The room exploded. People turned toward Tyrell so quickly that several chairs actually scraped against the floor. His face went pale. Not embarrassed pale. Caught pale. "You have no idea what you're talking about." "Really?" I tilted my head slightly. "Then perhaps you'd like to explain why you owe more than $80,000 in unpaid tax obligations." The reaction was immediate and brutal. Gasps echoed throughout the ballroom. Someone near the back actually said, 80,000? Loud enough for everyone to hear. Tyrell looked like he had been punched. Jordan closed his eyes briefly. Dolores stared at the floor. Tasha looked terrified. Nobody denied it. Nobody challenged the number, and that silence was more convincing than any confession. $80,000? I repeated. That's the man who wanted access to my office, my property, and apparently my financial decision-making process. A wave of laughter spread through the room. This time it was sharp, merciless. Tyrell's face darkened. Business setbacks happen. Tax liens happen when people ignore their responsibilities. More laughter. A few guests even applauded. The balance of power in the room had completely shifted now. Earlier, the Banks family had controlled the conversation. Now every sentence they spoke created another problem. "You're trying to humiliate us," Tyrell snapped. I looked genuinely surprised. "No, your financial records are humiliating you. I'm simply reading the results." The audience erupted again. Tyrell sank back into his chair. Defeated. Finished. But I wasn't done. Not even close. Slowly, I turned toward Tasha. The moment I did, she visibly panicked. Her eyes widened. Her posture changed. She looked exactly like someone watching a train approach while standing on the tracks. "Tasha," I said softly, "let's talk about that guest suite you've already claimed." Several guests laughed immediately. Others leaned forward in anticipation. Tasha forced a smile. "I think everyone understands I was joking." "No," I replied. "I don't think anyone believes that anymore." The room burst into laughter again. Tasha looked as though she wanted to disappear. "You told people tonight that your babysitter was already expecting a move." Silence. "You told people your family planned to occupy my home." More silence. "Would you like to explain why?" Tasha swallowed hard. "We were discussing possibilities." "Possibilities?" I repeated. "Like the possibility of being evicted?" The room went absolutely still. Even Tyrell looked shocked. Apparently, he hadn't expected that information to surface. Tasha's face drained of color. "Charmaine, no. Explain it." My voice remained calm. Calm was more effective than anger. Calm forced people to listen. "Explain why someone facing eviction thought she had the right to redesign rooms inside my house." The audience erupted. Some people laughed. Others gasped. Several simply stared in disbelief. The entitlement now looked even worse than it had before. It wasn't generosity they were seeking. It was rescue. Permanent rescue. At my expense. Tasha looked toward Jordan desperately. Jordan looked away. For the first time all evening, nobody was protecting anybody. Then I turned toward the center of the room again. "Do you see the pattern?" I asked the audience. "The woman who wants control of my investments is drowning in debt. The man who wants my office owes enormous tax obligations. The woman planning renovations in my house can't maintain her own housing situation." Complete silence. Nobody disagreed. Nobody could. The facts spoke for themselves. Then I slowly looked toward Jordan. The room followed my gaze. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. Not Dolores. Not Tyrell. Not Tasha. Jordan. Because everyone understood something important. None of this happened without him. And then there's Jordan. The ballroom became so quiet I could hear the air conditioning system again. Jordan stared at me. For the first time all evening, he looked genuinely afraid. Good. Fear meant he finally understood what was happening. The man who spent months telling me he loved me. I paused. The man who spent months telling me family mattered. Another pause. The man who spent months telling me we were building a future together. Jordan said nothing. "There's only one problem." I slowly reached into my purse and removed a set of keys. The audience looked confused. Jordan didn't. The moment he saw them, his expression changed completely. Jordan likes presenting himself as a successful man. I held up the keys. Many of you have probably seen him driving a black Mercedes G-Wagon. Several guests nodded. Jordan looked sick. "Beautiful vehicle," I continued. "Very expensive vehicle." The room was completely silent now. Everyone sensed the final blow approaching. Unfortunately, Jordan forgot one detail. I lifted the keys slightly higher. "The vehicle doesn't belong to him." The ballroom exploded. People gasped. Others laughed. Conversations erupted instantly. Jordan looked as though all the oxygen had left his body. "That's not— Actually, it is." I cut him off. "The vehicle belongs to my company." More gasps. More laughter. More disbelief. Jordan was authorized to use it through a charitable partnership arrangement. Ownership was never transferred. The room erupted again. Everything Jordan had carefully constructed throughout the evening was collapsing in real time. The successful provider, the family leader, the man prepared to guide my future, gone, reduced to borrowed appearances and borrowed authority. Then I took one slow step toward him. So, let's review. My voice remained calm, deadly calm. Your mother wanted my investments. Your brother wanted my office. Your sister-in-law wanted my guest rooms. Another step. And you wanted me to believe you were rescuing me. Jordan looked away. He couldn't meet my eyes anymore. Neither could anyone in his family. Because for the first time all night, the truth wasn't hiding behind speeches, traditions, or family values. It was standing in the center of the ballroom for everyone to see. And the most devastating part was that I still hadn't revealed the one fact capable of destroying their entire plan. The one fact I had not revealed yet was the only fact that truly mattered. Debts could embarrass them, tax problems could expose them, eviction notices could humiliate them, borrowed cars could destroy their image, but none of those things could legally stop their plan. Not completely. The real weapon was not in their financial records. It was in my own paperwork. Jordan seemed to sense that something worse was coming because he took one step toward me, lowering his voice as if speaking softly could somehow erase what everyone had already heard. Charmaine, that's enough. I turned to him slowly. Enough? The word echoed through the microphone. You mean enough truth? He glanced around the ballroom, visibly shaken by the number of people watching us. For the first time all night, Jordan Banks looked less like a man in control and more like a man trying to hold together a collapsing stage set with his bare hands. You made your point, he said. No, I replied. I exposed the background. I haven't made the point yet. The room fell quiet again. Dolores gripped the edge of her table with both hands. Tyrell looked as though he wanted to leave but lacked the courage to stand. Tasha had stopped crying and was now staring at me with pure hatred. They still did not understand. Even after everything, they were clinging to one final belief. They believed that the ceremony had already trapped me. They believed that once vows had been spoken and guests had applauded, I belonged to their family in some permanent way. That was their fatal mistake. I looked toward the wedding coordinator standing near the side entrance. Could you please bring me the blue folder from the bridal suite? Her eyes widened slightly. She nodded and disappeared quickly through the doors. A murmur moved through the ballroom. Jordan's face changed immediately. What blue folder? I smiled faintly. The one you never bothered to read. His throat moved as he swallowed. Dolores turned toward him. Jordan? He didn't answer. That silence was delicious. For months, he had spoken about paperwork as if it were a minor inconvenience. He had rushed discussions, skipped details, claimed legal language made everything feel unromantic. He had told me more than once that too much caution could poison trust. At the time, I thought he was sentimental. Now I understood he had been impatient. Impatient men make lazy predators. The coordinator returned less than a minute later, holding the folder against her chest. She handed it to me and stepped away as quickly as possible. I opened it slowly. Not because I needed time to find the document. I knew exactly where it was. I opened it slowly because silence can be more powerful than shouting when everyone is desperate to know what comes next. Throughout this evening, I said, the Banks family has repeatedly used one assumption to justify everything. I removed a document from the folder. They have assumed that because we had a ceremony today, Jordan is already my husband. Jordan's face went pale. The room shifted instantly. Guests leaned forward. Some turned to one another. Others stared directly at Jordan. Dolores looked confused at first, then irritated. He is your husband, she snapped. We all witnessed the ceremony. I nodded. You witnessed a ceremony. I lifted the document slightly. You did not witness a legal filing. The room exploded. Gasps, whispers, and sudden conversations rippled across every table. Someone near the back said, Wait, what? Loud enough for half the ballroom to hear. Jordan closed his eyes for one brief moment. That was when Dolores finally understood that something had gone terribly wrong. I continued calmly. Our private appointment with the judge was scheduled for tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. The ceremony today was ceremonial, emotional, public. The legal marriage was not yet completed. Every word seemed to land heavier than the last. Dolores stared at Jordan as though he had personally betrayed her. Tyrell whispered something under his breath. Tasha's mouth fell open. The extended relatives who had been judging me minutes earlier now looked completely stunned. "That's impossible," Dolores said. "No," I replied. "It's inconvenient for you." "There is a difference." A few guests laughed sharply. I looked at Jordan. "You knew this." He didn't respond. "You knew the legal documents had not been signed. You knew the courthouse appointment was tomorrow. You knew my attorney insisted on reviewing final protections before anything became official. Still nothing." His silence confirmed everything. Dolores turned on him. "Jordan, what is she talking about?" He ran a hand over his face. "Mom, what is she talking about?" she demanded again, louder this time. For the first time all evening, the Banks family began turning against itself. That was the beautiful thing about greedy alliances. They only last while everyone believes the money is still coming. Remove the prize, and loyalty evaporates. I looked back toward the guests. "Now, let's discuss the villa." The room went silent again. The property that Tyrell wanted to use for his trading operation. The property Tasha had already assigned to her children. The property Dolores believed would become available for family management. Tasha looked as though she might be sick. "That property," I continued, "is not in my personal name." Jordan's head snapped up. Dolores froze. Tyrell stopped breathing for a moment. "It is owned by a private holding company established years before I met Jordan." I let that sentence settle. "And before anyone misunderstands, Jordan has no ownership interest in that company. His family has no ownership interest in that company. No spouse, partner, in-law, dependent relative, extended family member, or household guest gains ownership, residency rights, management authority, or financial equity through marriage." The ballroom erupted again. This time the reaction was louder than before. People understood exactly what I had just said. The house had never been available. Not legally, not financially, not practically. Their entire plan had been built on a fantasy. "You can't do that," Tasha whispered. Her voice was small now, shaken. "I already did," Jordan said. Jordan lied. The words sliced cleanly through the room. Tasha looked at him. Dolores looked at him. Tyrell looked at him. Every member of his family suddenly wanted answers from the man who had promised them access to a kingdom he did not own. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Jordan finally stepped forward. "Charmaine, we can still talk about this." "No, we can't." "You're emotional." "I'm documented." A burst of laughter and applause broke out from several tables. Jordan flinched as though the sound physically hurt him. "Good. It should have. You told your family that after tomorrow, this would no longer be a problem," I said. "You were right about one thing. Tomorrow mattered." I lifted the unsigned legal document. "But not the way you thought." His face collapsed. The charming nonprofit director was gone. The supportive fiancé was gone. The confident family man was gone. What remained was a desperate man watching the largest financial opportunity of his life disappear in front of witnesses. "The appointment tomorrow is cancelled," I said clearly. The ballroom went completely still. "There will be no legal marriage." Dolores let out a sound halfway between a gasp and a cry. Tasha grabbed Tyrell's arm as though the floor had shifted beneath her. Jordan stared at me in total disbelief. "You don't mean that." "I do. You can't just cancel our marriage. There is no marriage to cancel." The silence that followed was almost beautiful. Not peaceful. Not gentle. Beautiful in the way justice can be beautiful when it finally arrives after humiliation. "There is no husband," I continued. "There is no shared estate. There is no family trust. There is no access to my accounts. There is no claim to my home. There is no legal pathway from your family to my life." Every sentence closed another door. One after another. Account, house, career, future, all locked, all mine. Jordan's eyes filled with panic. "Charmaine, please." That single word told me everything. Please. Not because he loved me. Not because he was sorry. Because he had lost. Dolores pushed herself up from the table. Her face was twisted with fury and fear. "You humiliated us on purpose." I looked at her calmly. "No, Dolores. You humiliated yourselves by assuming a woman with a legal team, a security system, and 15 years of acquisition experience would walk into a merger without reading the terms. The room reacted instantly. Gasps, laughter, applause. My colleagues understood the language perfectly. The Banks family had attempted a hostile takeover and failed to confirm whether the deal had closed. That was not just greed, that was incompetence. I lowered the document back into the folder. This wedding reception will continue for the guests who came here with honest intentions. Then I looked directly at the Banks family. But for everyone who came here expecting a payout, the celebration is over. Jordan reached for me. Not aggressively. Desperately. I stepped back before his fingers touched my arm. That small movement seemed to destroy him more than my words. "Don't touch me," I said. The microphone carried it across the entire room. He froze. "You are not my husband. You are not my partner. You are not family. You are a failed financial strategy wearing a tuxedo." The ballroom exploded. Some guests gasped. Others applauded. A few openly laughed. Jordan looked shattered, but I wasn't finished. The legal twist had destroyed their plan. Now there was only one thing left to do. Remove them from the room before their humiliation turned into violence. The second I said the words, "The celebration is over," the atmosphere inside the ballroom changed completely. Up until that point, the evening had felt like a public exposure, a humiliation, a disaster for the Banks family. But humiliation can still be survived. People recover from embarrassment. They recover from public mistakes. What they struggle to recover from is the moment everyone around them realizes they never had any power in the first place. Jordan stood frozen near the center of the room. His face had lost all color. His carefully constructed image had collapsed so thoroughly that I almost didn't recognize him. The confident nonprofit director was gone. The patient fiancé was gone. Even the entitled future husband was gone. What remained was a desperate man watching his future disappear in real time. "Charmaine," he said quietly, "please don't do this." The room immediately fell silent again. People wanted to hear his last attempt. They wanted to see whether there was anything left to save. Unfortunately for him, there wasn't. "Don't do what?" I asked calmly. "Tell the truth?" Jordan shook his head. "We can work through this. Work through this." The phrase would have been laughable if it weren't so insulting. "Your family spent months planning how to control my life." "That's not what happened. Your brother assigned himself my office." Jordan said nothing. "Your sister-in-law assigned herself my guest rooms." Silence. "Your mother announced a management structure for my assets." More silence. Every unanswered statement became another confession. Then Jordan tried a different strategy. "Nobody is perfect." Several guests actually laughed. Not because the statement was funny, because of how absurdly inadequate it sounded. Nobody is perfect. As if perfection had ever been the issue. I nodded slowly. "You're right." The room became quiet. "Nobody is perfect." I took a step toward him. "But most people manage to avoid organizing a financial ambush during their wedding reception." A wave of laughter erupted across the ballroom. Jordan looked down at the floor, defeated. Meanwhile, Dolores was unraveling. Throughout the evening, she had presented herself as the authority figure, the family leader, the woman who understood how things should work. Now she looked terrified. Not because she had lost me, because she had lost access. "Those are very different things. You manipulated everyone," she snapped. "You set us up." The accusation actually surprised me. Not because it was unfair, because it was revealing. People often accuse others of the exact behavior they intended to commit themselves. "Set you up?" I repeated. "You held a public hearing about my finances at my own wedding." Several guests nodded immediately. Others openly laughed. Dolores looked around the room, searching for support. There wasn't any. Not anymore. The audience had made its decision. Then Tyrell stood abruptly. The movement startled several people nearby. His face was red with anger. Enough of this. For the first time all evening, his voice sounded genuinely threatening. "We've listened to your insults long enough." My security director immediately took 2 steps forward from the side of the ballroom. That was another detail the Banks family had forgotten. People with significant assets rarely attend large events without professional protection nearby. Tyrell noticed the movement instantly. His confidence faded. "Sit down, Tyrell," I said calmly. The authority in my voice surprised even me. He hesitated, then slowly sat back down. The audience noticed. So did he. Nothing destroys a bully faster than discovering nobody is afraid of him. Tasha began crying again. Real tears this time. Not because she felt guilty, because the fantasy was dead. The house was gone. The guest suite was gone. The future she had already imagined for herself had vanished. "We told the kids," she whispered. Nobody responded, because for the first time all evening, everyone understood exactly what that statement meant. They had never hoped for generosity. They had expected ownership. The distinction mattered. Then Dolores made one final mistake. She pointed directly at me. "After everything Jordan has done for you." The room immediately reacted. Several guests laughed out loud. Others looked genuinely offended. I tilted my head slightly. "Everything Jordan has done for me?" Dolores nodded aggressively. "He loved you." Jordan closed his eyes. Even he knew that argument was dangerous now. "No," I replied softly. "He studied me." Silence. Complete silence. "He learned my insecurities." Another pause. "He learned my hopes." Another pause. "He learned what I wanted to hear." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Every guest was listening. And then he sold me a future that benefited everyone except me. The statement landed perfectly. Because it wasn't emotional. It was accurate. Jordan lowered his head. He knew it too. Then I looked toward the head of event security. We had worked together for years. He understood immediately. No explanation was necessary. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said into the microphone, "I sincerely apologize for the unexpected entertainment this evening." Laughter erupted throughout the ballroom. The tension finally broke. People relaxed for the first time in hours. However, the reception will continue. Applause followed. "The catering has already been paid for." More laughter. "The band has already been paid for." Louder laughter. And unlike some people here tonight, I believe in honoring financial commitments. The room exploded. Even several hotel employees laughed. Jordan looked physically ill. Then I turned toward the Banks family. My smile disappeared. As for the four of you, security began moving, slowly. Professionally. Deliberately. The sight finally made everything real. Dolores looked horrified. "You can't throw us out." "Actually, I can. We're family." "No." I looked directly into her eyes. "Family doesn't arrive with a strategy for asset acquisition." The guard stopped a few feet away. Jordan stepped forward. "Charmaine, don't do this in front of everyone." I almost laughed. That's an interesting request from the man who allowed his mother to present financial directives in front of everyone. The audience reacted immediately. Another wave of laughter. Another wave of applause. Jordan had no response. There wasn't one. Security politely asked the Banks family to leave. Dolores refused. For approximately 8 seconds. Then she realized nobody in the room was coming to her rescue. Not the guests. Not the staff. Not Jordan. Nobody. One by one, reality settled over them. The plan was dead. The marriage was dead. The access was dead. Everything was dead. Tasha stood first, crying. Tyrell followed, furious. Dolores followed, humiliated. Jordan remained where he was, frozen, watching the life he thought he had secured disappear in front of him. Finally, he looked at me. Was any of it real? The question almost broke my heart. Not because I still loved him, because a small part of me wished the answer were different. I took a long breath. Then I gave him the only honest answer available. I believed it was. Jordan closed his eyes. The words hit harder than any insult could have, because they confirmed the truth. I had been real. He hadn't. Security escorted the family toward the exit, while 200 guests watched silently. Nobody stopped them. Nobody defended them. Nobody followed. At the doorway, Jordan turned one final time. For a brief moment, our eyes met across the ballroom. Then he walked out. The doors closed behind them. And just like that, the Banks family disappeared from my future forever. Or at least, that's what I believed in that moment. Because I still hadn't seen my phone. I still hadn't seen the messages. And I definitely hadn't seen the 85 missed calls waiting for me before the night was over. When the ballroom doors finally closed behind Jordan and his family, the silence felt almost unreal. For the first time all evening, nobody was arguing. Nobody was making demands. Nobody was trying to explain why my life should belong to someone else. They were simply gone. The reception hall that had felt like a battlefield only minutes earlier suddenly felt peaceful. I stood near the center of the room holding the microphone while nearly 200 guests watched me. Some looked shocked, some looked relieved. Others looked as though they had just witnessed something they would be talking about for years. The strange thing was that I didn't feel victorious. Not yet. I felt exhausted. Betrayal has a way of draining every ounce of energy from your body. The adrenaline fades, the anger cools, and what's left is the realization that someone you trusted was never the person you believed them to be. One of my closest friends approached first, then another, then another. Within minutes, I was surrounded by people offering support, encouragement, and sympathy. For months, I had believed the Banks family represented belonging. Standing there that night, I realized something important. Real belonging doesn't come from people demanding access to your life. It comes from people who remain beside you when they have nothing to gain. Eventually, someone handed me a glass of champagne. Someone else convinced the band to start playing again. The reception slowly transformed from a disaster into something unexpected. A celebration. Not of marriage, of survival. Every person in that room had watched me choose self-respect over fear, and somehow that felt worth celebrating. Several hours later, after most guests had gone home, I finally sat down in a quiet corner of the ballroom and looked at my phone. The screen lit up immediately. 85 missed calls, dozens of text messages, several voicemails. I didn't need to guess who they were from. Dolores, Tyrell, Tasha, Jordan. More calls from Jordan, then more from Dolores, then Jordan again. I laughed softly. Earlier that evening, those people had believed they were about to gain permanent access to my future. Now they couldn't even gain access to a returned phone call. I listened to exactly one voicemail. Jordan's. His voice sounded completely different than it had only a few hours earlier. Gone was the confidence. Gone was the certainty. Gone was the superiority. What remained was desperation. He said there had been misunderstandings. He said emotions had taken over. He said we should talk privately. He said he still loved me. Then he asked me to call him back. I deleted the voicemail before it finished. Not because I hated him, because I finally understood him. Understanding someone often removes the desire to argue with them. There was nothing left to discuss. The next morning, instead of attending a courthouse appointment, I met my attorney for breakfast. We spent less than 15 minutes canceling the remaining legal paperwork. The process was surprisingly simple. No divorce, no litigation, no division of assets, no years of legal battles. Just signatures confirming that a marriage had never legally existed. The irony was almost beautiful. The Banks family had spent months planning how to benefit from a marriage that never officially happened. One unsigned document had protected everything. My attorney smiled when the final paperwork was completed. "You know," he said, "this may be the cheapest lesson you've ever learned." He was right. Expensive emotionally, cheap legally. And I would choose that outcome every single time. Over the following weeks, the consequences spread quickly. Atlanta is a large city, but professional circles are surprisingly small. Stories travel, reputations travel faster. People who attended the reception talked. People who heard about it talked even more. The Banks family became infamous in certain circles almost overnight. Dolores stopped giving lectures about financial responsibility. Tyrell discovered that potential investors suddenly became less interested in his grand business ideas. Tasha found that people were remarkably unwilling to discuss moving into homes they didn't own. As for Jordan, he lost something much more valuable than money. He lost credibility. Once trust disappears, rebuilding it can take years. Sometimes it never happens at all. Several months later, I learned through mutual acquaintances that the family blamed one another for everything. Dolores blamed Jordan for mishandling the situation. Tyrell blamed Dolores for revealing too much too early. Tasha blamed everyone. Jordan blamed circumstances. None of them blamed themselves. That wasn't surprising. People who view themselves as victims rarely recognize their own role in creating disasters. The most interesting update arrived nearly 6 months after the wedding. I received a brief message from someone who had attended one of Jordan's nonprofit events. According to the message, Jordan had told people that he and I simply wanted different things from life. Different things. The understatement made me laugh for nearly 5 minutes. He wanted access. I wanted honesty. Those are very different things. Life eventually returned to normal. Then something even better happened. It became peaceful. The villa felt different after that night. Not because the house had changed, because I had. For years, I believed loneliness was my greatest weakness. That belief had made me vulnerable. Vulnerable to people who recognized the hunger for connection and saw an opportunity. The Banks family didn't target my money first. They targeted my loneliness. My money was simply what they hoped to collect afterward. Once I understood that, everything changed. I stopped viewing solitude as a problem that needed solving. I started viewing it as freedom. Freedom to choose carefully. Freedom to walk away. Freedom to protect what I had built. About a year later, I hosted another gathering at the villa. Smaller, simpler, better. Friends filled the house. Music played softly through the speakers. People laughed on the balcony overlooking the gardens. At one point during the evening, someone jokingly asked whether I was dating anyone new. The entire group became quiet, waiting for my answer. I smiled and raised my glass. Maybe someday. Everyone laughed. Then I added something I genuinely believed. The difference is that next time, anyone interested in my future will have to bring their own. The applause that followed felt warmer than anything I remembered from my wedding day. Because it wasn't celebrating a fantasy, it was celebrating a lesson learned. Looking back now, I don't regret meeting Jordan Banks. I don't regret the engagement. I don't even regret the wedding reception disaster. Those experiences taught me something priceless. Love should add value to your life, not extract it. Family should protect your future, not divide it. And anyone who arrives carrying a calculator instead of a heart should never be trusted with either. The Banks family thought they had found a woman desperate enough to surrender everything for acceptance. Instead, they found a woman willing to lose a wedding in order to keep herself. And in the end, that wasn't a tragedy. It was the best investment I ever made.